The letter she never sent. The rain fell softly in Los Angeles that evening, not in a cinematic downpour, but in a steady, whispering drizzle that seemed to ask permission to land on the pavement. The world had slowed down, just enough for her to notice it. Sandra sat by the window of her home, a home that once rang with laughter, echoing footsteps, and the rhythm of love's comfort. Now it sat quiet. Not cold, not broken, just paused, like a breath caught between memories and what might have been. In her hand was a letter, aged by time and creased by the fingers of hesitation. The ink had faded slightly, not because it was old, but because she'd read it so many times. She never sent it. She never dared. And yet she couldn't bring herself to destroy it either, because that letter was her truth. Raw, unfinished, unsent. It began with 2 words. I'm sorry. Not for anything she did wrong, but for all the things she never had the courage to say, for the words she buried in silence, thinking time would make it easier. It never did. The letter had been written years ago, in a hotel room, hours after they parted ways, when the script of their lives no longer had them in the same scene. She remembered the exact moment. Keanu had kissed her forehead at the airport. Not her lips. Her forehead, the place you kiss someone when you love them, but the timing is wrong. And she had smiled, like it was okay, like her heart wasn't falling apart behind her ribs. She had watched him walk away. Strong, graceful, composed, and she had gone back to her hotel, ordered tea she didn't drink, and wrote a letter she never sent. That letter had followed her through life, folded into books, tucked behind drawer mirrors, placed under pillows when sleep wouldn't come. But she never let it go. Because she had never let him go, Keanu had been different. The kind of different that doesn't shout to be seen. The kind that simply is. Gentle in a world that celebrated sharpness. Thoughtful in a city that applauded noise. He didn't love loudly, but he loved fully. In glances, in silence, in presence. When he looked at her, it wasn't as a star, an actress, or an icon. He saw Sandra, the woman who cried over dog movies, who wrote poetry on napkins, who doubted herself at 3 a.m., despite millions clapping for her on screen. With Keanu, she was just her, and that terrified her. Because to be seen that clearly means to be known that deeply. And what if, after all that knowing, he walked away? He never did, not completely. But life did. Projects pulled them in different directions. Grief crept in uninvited. Loss turned the color of days to grayscale. He had lost people. She had lost herself. And in the quiet between calls, between I miss you texts that came too late, between premieres and red carpets and charity galas, they slipped, like a thread pulled from a favorite sweater, unraveling slowly until there was only warmth left without form. The letter remained. I'm sorry for letting go in silence, it read, when all I wanted was to scream your name at the edge of the world and ask you to stay. But she hadn't screamed. She hadn't asked. And he hadn't stayed. Not because he didn't want to, but because she never gave him the space to. And that regret had built a home in her chest. Not a heavy one, just familiar. Like a song that plays in the background of every quiet moment. She learned to live around it. Like people live around grief, around what-ifs, around memories that refuse to age. But that night, with the rain humming on her window and the silence no longer comforting, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the sky looked like it was morning too. Maybe it was the picture she had accidentally dropped while organizing old boxes. A photo of them in Prague, both laughing mid-bite as she fed him from her plate. Unposed, unplanned, undeniably real. She stared at that photo for minutes, as if trying to remember what her laughter sounded like in that moment. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She reached for her phone, not to scroll, not to post, but to search. For him, Keanu Reeves was not a man easy to reach. He didn't swim in the spotlight. He visited it, bowed politely, and left before the noise became too loud. But she knew his rhythms, knew his patterns, knew he still had a motorcycle shop downtown, that he sometimes read at that little cafe near Melrose, that he still sent Christmas donations anonymously to the Children's Hospital. Because when someone is part of your heartbeat, you don't forget. You just learn to live with the echo. And that night, with the letter in one hand and her phone in the other, she sent a message. Not long, not dramatic, just 3 words. I still remember. She didn't expect a reply. She didn't even know if it was the right number. But she needed to send something. Anything. Because holding on to ghosts was making her forget how to breathe. 2 days passed. Nothing. And she told herself it was okay. Closure wasn't about replies. It was about release. She placed the letter back in its usual place. Inside her grandmother's old copy of Little Women. Page 147. The page where Joe writes about heartbreak but chooses courage anyway. She smiled at the irony. Life had a strange sense of timing. On the 3rd day, the doorbell rang. Not a buzz, a ring. As if someone was standing there. Present, patient, and waiting. She opened the door, and there he stood. Keanu, not the man from movie posters or award shows, but him. Older, softer, real, his hair slightly longer, rain on his jacket, and eyes that looked like they had carried galaxies of silence, and still, they softened when they met hers. I got your message, he said. She didn't speak, couldn't. Her throat was tight with the weight of years, of everything unsaid, undone, unhealed. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, gently, carefully, like it was made of ash. I kept mine too, he whispered, and as the paper unfolded in his hand, she saw it. Her own handwriting, faded ink, worn creases, the letter she had never sent. I found it, he said, eyes steady, voice trembling. Years ago. You must have left it in my book. I never had the courage to bring it up. Until now. She stared at it, the words she once feared would break them. Now, floating between them like a bridge. I'm here. When silence speaks louder than regret. The fireplace crackled with a low, steady rhythm, its light casting a soft amber hue across the room, flickering against old wooden beams and the edges of a leather-bound journal resting on the table between them. It wasn't a reunion that needed noise. There were no exclamations, no dramatic embraces, no forced laughter to fill the space. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when 2 people, long separated by circumstance and choice, allow the truth to exist between them without resistance. Sandra sat on the far end of the couch, legs tucked under her like she used to do years ago when they'd talk about philosophy at 2 a.m. after movie shoots. Keanu, just inches away, held the unsent letter in his hand as though it were a fragile relic. Something sacred, something that had held them both in place all these years. He didn't rush to speak. That was never his way. With Keanu, time moved slower. Not because he lacked urgency, but because he respected the weight of moments. He understood that pain didn't need fixing, only witnessing. And so, he sat there with her, in the presence of everything they never said, everything they thought they'd buried, and everything that still remained. The air was heavy, not with tension, but with history. And as the wind tapped against the windows outside and the city carried on obliviously beyond those walls, Sandra finally spoke, not with words rehearsed, but with the kind that form only when there's nothing left to prove. Do you remember that night in Kyoto? She asked, her voice gentle, almost unsure of itself. He turned toward her slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. The ryokan with the koi pond, he replied as though he had been waiting years for her to bring it up. She nodded. I sat by the water after you fell asleep. I watched the fish move without sound and I thought, this is what being safe feels like. He smiled. Not wide, but deeply. The kind of smile that says, yes, I remember. I felt it too. It had been over a decade since that trip. A film festival. An impromptu escape from the flashing lights. They had both been too tired of being looked at and not seen. So they disappeared. To a quiet corner of the world where no one asked for autographs, where slippers were left at doors and meals were served with ceremony. They had stayed up one night under paper lanterns, talking about their fears. Not fears of fading fame or aging on screen, but the deeper kind, the fear of becoming emotionally unreachable, of waking up next to someone who didn't know your silence, of success costing you your softness. And yet, even after that night, they had let life split them. Not because they didn't care, but because caring deeply doesn't always guarantee staying. Sometimes, love arrives with bad timing and leaves you with perfect memories. "I was angry at you," she confessed, breaking her gaze from the fire. "I blamed you for walking away first. But the truth is, I never told you to stay." Keanu looked down, his hand running over the edge of the letter. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "You were healing from things I didn't understand. I didn't want to be another weight on your chest." "But you weren't a weight," she said, her voice firm for the first time that night. "You were the only place I felt light." A long silence followed, but this time it didn't hurt. It felt necessary, like they were letting each word settle, like rain soaking into dry ground. After a few moments, he stood and walked toward the bookshelf where she kept old scripts, dusty trophies, and a small ceramic figure he had once gifted her. A silent monk carved from dark stone, kneeling with closed eyes and hands folded. He picked it up carefully, held it in his palm, and turned back to her. "You kept him," he said softly. Sandra nodded. "He didn't leave." That line, simple and quiet, landed between them like thunder. And suddenly, everything shifted. The years didn't vanish. The past wasn't erased, but in that moment, the pain of separation found a resting place. No longer something to carry, just something to honor. She got up and walked toward him, her eyes never leaving his. He set the statue down and they stood face to face. Older, more scarred, but no less capable of connection. She reached out slowly, brushing a raindrop from his shoulder, though it had long since dried. "I never stopped wondering what we could have been," she said, voice trembling. "And I never stopped hoping you'd find me again," he replied. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no violins, no sudden kisses. Just two people stripped of ego, fame, and fear, standing in the presence of something unfinished, something still alive. They didn't try to define it. Not yet. They just let it breathe. That night they stayed up talking. Not about what they missed, but about who they had become. Keanu spoke about the years he spent in quiet corners of the world, learning to ride out grief, reading books on metaphysics, planting trees in memory of friends he'd lost. Sandra spoke about the silence that followed her adoptive mother's passing, the way loneliness echoed even in rooms full of applause, and how she had once tried to replace love with work, only to find that cameras don't hold you at night. And then, near 2 a.m., as the embers faded to soft orange and the city outside slowed to a hush, she brought out something he hadn't expected. A box, simple, worn, inside dozens of Polaroids. Them, in Europe, on set, at coffee shops during rehearsals, laughing, dancing, hiding behind books in public just to have a moment of normal. She had kept it all. "I didn't want to forget us," she said. He pulled out a photo of them on a bench near the Seine, her head on his shoulder, his hand on her knee, both of them unaware someone was taking the shot. "You didn't," he said, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. She laid her head on his shoulder, just like the photo. And he didn't move, didn't flinch, just let her be. For minutes. For hours. For everything that had passed. Because sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures or epic speeches. It comes when the past is allowed to sit quietly beside the present, and neither has to pretend. As the sky turned pale with morning light, Sandra stirred. "I don't know what this means," she whispered. "It doesn't have to mean anything," he replied. "It just has to feel honest." And in that, she found peace. Not because he was back, but because she was. The things we almost said. The morning sun crept gently across the hardwood floor, golden streaks painting warmth into a room that had forgotten the sound of laughter. The scent of shared coffee, the rustle of familiarity and footsteps long absent. Sandra stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug that trembled slightly between her hands. Not from cold, but from a kind of emotional disorientation. Having Keanu there again felt like waking up in a version of her life she'd mourned years ago, the kind of dream you wake from aching because it was never real. But this was real. He was here, not in memory, not in theory, but sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, sifting through old vinyl records like time had pressed pause on their separate grief and dared them to breathe together again. She watched him quietly. The curve of his back, the slowness of his movements, the way he still tilted his head slightly when reading the fine print on album covers. It was like watching a film she'd seen 100 times. Familiar in all the best ways, but Keanu sat down, picked up a page, and began to read. Not rushed, not flipping through them like someone curious, but absorbing each line like someone who had waited years to be understood. One letter described the time she had seen him in a magazine, smiling, surrounded by people, and how she had smiled too. Grateful he looked happy. Devastated she wasn't part of that frame. Another was a simple poem. You left without taking your silence with you. He read every page, every single one. And when he finished, he looked up with tears balanced in his lashes but never falling, because Keanu had always held pain like a monk, quietly, without burdening others. These, he said softly, his voice breaking, are the most beautiful things anyone's ever written about me. She sat beside him, finally letting the tears fall. Not because she was sad, but because the burden of carrying love in silence for so long had finally found a voice. I was afraid, she confessed, that loving you out loud would make you disappear. But I was afraid not loving you would make me forget how to feel, he answered. That night, they cooked together, just like they used to on set between takes. Pasta, nothing fancy. She chopped garlic, he stirred the sauce. It was so ordinary it felt sacred. They didn't talk much during dinner. There was something holy about chewing in silence when both your hearts were loud with healing. Afterward, as they did dishes, she drying, he rinsing, Keanu turned to her and asked the question that had lingered in both their eyes all day. Why didn't we fight for this? Sandra placed the plate down slowly, her fingers brushing a drop of water away before answering. Because we thought letting go was more noble than holding on. He nodded slowly. We were wrong. And then, with water dripping from his fingertips, he reached across the counter and touched her cheek. Not kissed, just touched, as if to say, I'm still here. And she leaned into his hand, not because she needed to be saved, but because she was finally ready to be seen. Later that night, she pulled out a suitcase she hadn't used in 5 years. The last trip they were supposed to take together, Florence. She had never gone, but she had packed for it. The suitcase was still full, tucked away in the closet of a room she never used anymore. He helped her unzip it. Inside were summer dresses still with tags, travel books with notes scribbled in the margins, and a small envelope marked, For Florence. She opened it. Inside was a single page. If we ever get to go, I hope you still want to hold my hand in public. Keanu looked at her, then gently reached down and laced his fingers through hers. I never stopped wanting that, he whispered. They didn't say anything else, they didn't need to, because some stories don't need fixing, they just need continuing, and in that moment, in the quiet of a home that had waited patiently for a heartbeat to return, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, no longer characters, no longer legends, just two souls tired of pretending not to care, finally began the chapter that fear had delayed for too long. The cabin. That remembered, the plane hummed quietly as it sliced through the sky, leaving behind the glittering haze of Los Angeles for something older, quieter and untouched by flashing bulbs and scripted smiles. Sandra sat by the window, arms crossed over a soft wool sweater, watching clouds drift beneath them like folded parchment, while Keanu sat beside her, reading something in a small, leather-bound journal. Not hers, not his, but something that belonged to them now. A shared space of vulnerability they had unknowingly begun writing the moment she sent that first message. I still remember. It hadn't taken long to decide. Once truth enters the room, indecision fades fast. They both knew they needed space. Away from the history echoing in her walls, away from the weight of their separate routines, away from the idea that healing must happen only in silence. So they went north, to a cabin neither had seen in years, but both had loved long before they loved each other. The cabin stood nestled at the edge of a pine forest near Big Sur, where the trees whispered old names and the ocean was close enough to smell even when you couldn't see it. It had belonged to an old producer friend, long gone now, who had once told Sandra, "Come here when the world forgets how to love you." She had come once, during a breakup in her 30s, and once more after her mother's passing. But never with him. And yet, as Keanu stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on pine needles, his eyes took in the structure like it was a memory buried in his bones. The cabin was built from dark timber and still leaned slightly to the left, as though humbled by time. The front porch sagged gently under its own weight, but the light above the door flickered on like it had been expecting them all along. Inside, the furniture was simple. 2 armchairs, a worn leather couch, bookshelves filled with titles untouched in years, and a fireplace surrounded by stone that still held the scent of old wood smoke. Sandra walked slowly through the space, her fingers trailing across surfaces like she was rediscovering herself, and Keanu followed, not too close, giving her space to remember, or maybe to forget. They didn't unpack that night. Instead, they opened the windows to let the wind sing its lullaby through the trees, made tea, and sat across from each other on the floor in front of the fireplace. No music, no devices. Just firelight and the sound of pine cones dropping outside. Nature reminding them that even falling things can land gently. "I used to think silence meant abandonment," Sandra said after a long pause. Keanu didn't interrupt. He never did. He simply looked at her the way people look at ancient ruins, with reverence, and the quiet awareness that they're not supposed to rebuild them, only understand them. "But this," she continued, gesturing to the space between them, "this silence feels like presence." He nodded, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photo, one of the 2 of them. Taken years ago during a charity event in Vancouver, she was mid-laugh holding a child's hand. He was looking at her, not the camera, always her. The edges were creased, the ink slightly faded, but the emotion in the image hadn't aged a day. "I carried this," he said, setting it on the rug between them, "even when I told myself I had moved on." She picked up the photo and studied it, not like a celebrity, but like a woman looking at a mirror of another life. "You always looked at me like I was more than what I believed I was," she whispered. "Because you were," he answered without hesitation. That night, they didn't sleep in separate rooms. Not because passion rushed them, but because being apart no longer made sense. They lay under a thick quilt on the same bed, her back against his chest, his arm resting gently over her ribs. And for the first time in a long time, they both slept through the night without waking from grief's quiet hands. In the days that followed, time stretched and softened. Mornings began with fresh coffee and barefoot steps on cold wood floors. Afternoons were spent hiking through mossy trails, pausing often to sit and breathe in the kind of air that has never known city noise. They didn't speak constantly. They didn't need to. Sometimes they held hands in silence. Sometimes they argued about whether it would rain. Sometimes they laughed over memories they had each remembered differently, and it felt like finding pieces of themselves in the other person's version of the story. But the healing wasn't all sweet. One evening, they found themselves in a storm, not outside, but between them. They had been sitting at the table, a game of chess half played, when Sandra suddenly stood and paced to the window, arms folded tightly. "You left, you know," she said, her voice sharp. "You left, even when you say you didn't." Keanu looked up slowly, his expression calm but focused. "I gave you space," he replied gently. "You were drowning. I thought I'd be another wave. You should have been the shore," she cried, turning to face him, eyes ablaze. "I needed you to hold me underwater and remind me that I could still breathe." The room went still, and then something in her cracked. Not broken. cracked open like a seed breaking through earth. She sank to the floor, tears falling freely, years of control unraveling all at once. He moved beside her, slowly, cautiously, like approaching a wounded animal. He didn't touch her immediately. He let her sob, her body trembling with the effort of letting go. "I didn't know how," he whispered after a while, "to be near your pain without making it worse." She looked up, eyes swollen, raw with truth. "You could have just said that. I didn't need perfection. I needed honesty." He took her hand then. Not to pull her up, but to keep her grounded. "I'm learning," he said. "So am I," she replied. After that, things changed again, not back to old comfort, but forward into something truer. They began to write again, not scripts, not stories, but letters, to each other. Keanu would leave folded notes on her pillow. Sandra would slip them under his coffee cup. Some were pages long, some just a sentence. "I forgive you for not knowing," or "Thank you for listening when I couldn't speak." And slowly the cabin changed too. Plants began to bloom in corners that had long been dust. The kitchen felt warmer, the bed fuller, the air lighter. It was as if the building itself had been holding its breath for years. And now, finally, with them here, with pain named and love reclaimed, it could exhale. One evening, as golden hour drenched the forest in molten light, Sandra took out a camera and asked him to stand under the tall pine where the light hit his face just right. He raised an eyebrow. "Since when are you behind the camera?" She grinned, adjusting the lens. "Since I realized some moments aren't meant to be lived in front of one." He stood still and she clicked the shutter. One photo, just one. But it captured everything. A man, no longer hiding behind sorrow, looking at the woman who had taught him to stay. Later, she printed the photo, wrote a single line on the back, and handed it to him. "Thank you for being the one person I didn't have to perform for." He tucked it into his journal, without a word, because some love doesn't need to be spoken, it just needs to be held. And in the quiet cabin that remembered everything they once tried to forget, two people who had lost each other found the space to start again. Not as they were, but as they now were. Wounded, wiser, still capable of wonder. Where the stars don't lie. There are places where time bends, not forward or back, but inward, folding memories and moments into something sacred, something unspoken yet felt in every breath. The cabin had become such a place, not just a retreat, but a witness, holding within its creaking floorboards and sun-streaked windows the quiet evolution of two people who had carried too much silence and too many unsent letters. And now, as autumn crept softly into the trees, brushing the pines with faint orange tips and leaving the air crisp with honesty, Keanu and Sandra found themselves on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, mugs of cider warming their hands, their hearts heavy with something both tender and terrifying. What comes next? They hadn't spoken of the future. Not directly. Not because they feared it, but because this moment, their now, had felt like a delicate shell, Too much weight and it might crack. Too little courage and it might float away like fog before the sun. But as Sandra leaned her head against Keanu's shoulder and listened to the wind slide between the trees like a song she used to know, she realized something was shifting again. Not the place, not even the man beside her, but the rhythm of her own breathing. It no longer sounded like survival. It sounded like return. "I had a dream last night," she said quietly, the words brushing his shoulder like autumn leaves. "You were on a stage, and the audience kept asking you questions about your past. And you just stood there, still, quiet. And then finally you said, 'Ask me about what I'm still becoming.'" Keanu didn't move, but he smiled slowly, his eyes half closed. "That sounds like me," he murmured. "Terrible at interviews. Great at disappearing," Sandra chuckled, the sound surprising even herself. "Do you still feel like disappearing?" He paused before answering. "Not when I'm with you." The truth of that landed gently. No declarations, no fireworks, just that steady honesty that had always made him different. The way he never tried to rescue her pain or wrap it in solutions, just sat beside it, made space for it, let her choose when to speak. It made her trust him with parts of herself she hadn't even known were still waiting to be seen. Later that evening, as the sky darkened into that specific velvet blue only found in forests far from cities, they walked through the pines with a flashlight and a quilt tucked under Keanu's arm. He led her to a clearing he had found the day before, a quiet place where the trees opened wide enough for the stars to fall through. They spread the quilt on the grass and lay down side by side, staring up into the quiet chaos of constellations, a sky that had witnessed both their separate ache and their fragile return. "I used to wish I'd been born in a different time," Keanu said softly. Eyes locked on Orion's belt, Sandra turned to him, curious. "Why?" "Because maybe then I'd understand what to do with feelings like this," he said. "With a love that doesn't obey logic, doesn't follow plot, doesn't care about closure. A love that just stays, even when it's quiet." She didn't reply immediately. Her throat ached with something she wasn't ready to name. But she reached for his hand, fingers sliding between his like ivy finding its way through brick. "I don't want closure," she whispered. "I want continuation. I want to grow old, knowing I loved you imperfectly, but I never stopped showing up." His fingers tightened slightly around hers. No vows, no promises. Just pressure. Just presence. And in that moment, under a sky older than any of their regrets, Sandra Bullock let go of one last thing, the belief that her heart was safer alone. They spent that night in the clearing, wrapped in quilts and words that hadn't yet made their way into language. They watched stars fall and dared to believe some were falling just for them, not to grant wishes, but to mirror what love looks like when it stops hiding. Bright, reckless, inevitable. In the days that followed, they began to make small plans. Nothing grand, nothing permanent, just sketches. Keanu wanted to take her to Kyoto again, not for a festival or a retreat, but to revisit the ryokan where silence first taught them how to listen. Sandra wanted to invite him to Oregon, to the bookstore her mother once loved, where she'd buried handwritten notes between pages like seeds. They cooked new recipes, burned a few, laughed about it. Keanu learned to make her favorite tea the exact way she liked it, strong, with honey, never stirred. Sandra rediscovered her old camera, and with each photograph she took of him, reading, thinking, walking through morning fog, she captured a version of him the world would never see, the kind not filtered through lenses or rolls, just him, just them. But then came the call. It was late afternoon when her phone rang, buzzing faintly on the windowsill. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut whispered, "Answer." It was her agent. A project. A major one. Filming in Rome. 3 months. The kind of role she'd once dreamed about before dreams changed. She hung up slowly, her hands cold despite the fireplace. Keanu looked up from his journal. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It's a big opportunity." He said nothing for a moment, just studied her with those unreadable eyes. Then he stood, walked over and took her hands in his, "You should go," he said. "I don't want to go," she replied, her voice almost a child's. "But you want to be the woman who still says yes to the parts that make her come alive," he said. She stared at him, a million thoughts running through her mind. What if we lose this again? What if we're not strong enough this time? What if I need you and you're not there? But none of them made it to her lips. Instead, she whispered, "What if we don't know how to do long distance anymore?" He leaned in, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "Then we learn. Like we're learning everything else." That night, as they packed the suitcase she hadn't touched since Florence, Sandra realized something profound. This time, she wasn't leaving to forget. She was leaving to remember who she was, with him in her heart, not as a haunting, but as a home, and Keanu, who had once feared becoming a weight, now stood in the doorway, steady and soft, reminding her that true love doesn't ask us to shrink. It asks us to grow, even when it hurts. As she turned to look at him one last time before boarding her flight, he smiled and said the same words that had begun this entire unfolding. "I'm here." And she, with tears slipping silently down her cheeks, finally replied the way she'd always wanted to, "I know." The day she didn't cry time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. It doesn't erase pain, but it polishes it into something you can hold without bleeding. Months had passed since Sandra left for Rome, and with her departure came the test every love story eventually faces. Not whether two people feel deeply, but whether they're willing to endure deeply. Love in absence, like faith in silence, requires a kind of surrender that cannot be taught. And yet, here they were, two people on opposite ends of the world, writing their way back to each other one page, one call, one small, brave promise at a time. Sandra's mornings were filled with early call times, scripts and sunrises over cobbled streets. Rome glowed with that ancient beauty that makes everything feel cinematic, but not even the Colosseum could distract her from the memory of Keanu's voice reading poetry into the fireplace light. He had sent her letters, real ones, every Thursday without fail, postmarked with drawings of trees, pressed wildflowers, and small notes like, "Still thinking about your laugh on the trail," or "The cabin misses the sound of your tea kettle." She didn't write back every time, but she read every word. She folded each letter with care and kept them in her coat pocket like matches on a cold day, reminders that warmth was never too far. Keanu, meanwhile, had returned to Los Angeles, not to vanish into his old routines, but to rebuild his life with intention. He took fewer roles, spent more time on his motorcycle, started volunteering at a bookstore that housed a reading room for kids who needed quiet. He didn't chase distraction. He welcomed solitude, not as a wall but as a room where her presence echoed softly, reminding him that even alone, he wasn't without her. He carried her in his pauses, in the spaces between scenes, in the way he began seeing the world not as something to endure, but something to feel again. They never defined what they were. There were no ultimatums, no deadlines, just two people slowly letting go of fear. Until one morning, 6 months into the separation, Sandra received no letter. Thursday passed, then Friday. By Saturday, her chest began to tighten with worry. Not dread, but the kind of fear that grows loud in silence. She told herself he was busy, that the mail was slow, but a part of her, the part that had learned how to feel again, knew something had shifted, and then, on Sunday morning, she received an envelope. No stamp, no postmark, just one word written in Keanu's handwriting. Home. Her heart surged as she stepped out into the Roman morning, phone in hand, dialing without hesitation. He didn't answer, but a text followed. "Check the train station." Confused, she hurried through the city, her scarf flapping in the wind, her heels echoing against centuries-old stone. The train station buzzed with life, with hellos and goodbyes and people in transit. And there, standing by the arrivals board, with a backpack slung over his shoulder and a single sunflower in his hand, was Keanu. No crowd noticed him, but she did. She walked to him slowly, her breath uneven, her eyes wide. "You flew here?" she asked, stunned. "I couldn't wait for another Thursday," he said, holding out the sunflower. "I needed to give this one in person." She laughed, breathless, overwhelmed, reaching for the flower like it was a lifeline. "I thought something happened," she whispered. "It did," he replied. "I realized I don't want to be a chapter in your life. I want to be the margin. Always there, holding the story together." She didn't cry. That surprised her, because this time, the emotion didn't arrive as pain. It arrived as peace. They spent the next week in Rome, not as tourists or lovers trying to recreate the past, but as two people fully awake in the present. They ate on rooftops, walked until their feet ached, talked about everything and nothing. He stayed in her rented flat, and they slept holding hands like kids who feared dreams might steal each other away. And one night, on a bridge overlooking the Tiber River, he took her hand again, slower this time, not out of impulse but out of clarity. "I love you," he said. She didn't say it back right away. She just looked at him, long, deep, honest. And then finally, she whispered, "I know," and he smiled, not hurt, not waiting, because love isn't always about being echoed. Sometimes it's about being understood. When Sandra's filming wrapped a few weeks later, they didn't return to Los Angeles. They returned to the cabin. Together. No longer as visitors of memory, but as builders of something new. They painted the walls, replaced the creaky porch, planted a row of saplings along the edge of the clearing, and every night they'd sit under the stars, not talking about the past or planning the future, but living in the quiet certainty that they had chosen each other, not once, but over and over, even in the moments when it had been hardest. Years later, when the world had moved on and the spotlight faded, people would still ask about them, about what happened, about why they disappeared from Hollywood's public frame, but the answer wasn't a headline. It was this: they loved. Not for the cameras, not for the fairy tale, but for the spaces between, and in those spaces they found everything.